The morning was heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the earth like a veil, muffling the sounds of the world. Along the river's edge, where the trees whispered in the wind, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz hummed as it came to a halt on the narrow dirt road. The engine's hum cut through the silence, a stark contrast to the peaceful stillness of the morning. The driver, a man dressed in a sharp, dark suit, stepped out with an air of cold detachment. His name was Eduardo Montenegro. The wealth that surrounded him, from the polished shoes on his feet to the car that reflected the sun's first light, gave him an aura of power, but there was no warmth in his gaze. He opened the trunk and pulled out a wicker basket, the soft whimpering of newborns barely audible from inside. With a glance around, ensuring no one was nearby, he walked toward the riverbank. His face, usually calm and composed, twitched for a fleeting second. It was as if the weight of the decision was sinking in. He stopped just short of the water, the morning mist curling around his legs. His cold gray eyes locked on the basket, his expression unwavering. The crying grew louder, more desperate, as if the baby sensed the looming danger. Eduardo's gaze remained fixed. Without hesitation, he shoved the basket into the river. The current tugged at it, slowly pulling it away from the shore. He didn't look back as he stepped into his car and drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. There was no remorse, no second thought, just the coldness of a man who saw his offspring as nothing more than a nuisance. What Eduardo didn't see, however, was the white figure in the distance. Hidden behind the dense thicket of trees, a majestic white horse, its coat gleaming like snow in the faint morning light, stood watching. The animal's dark eyes were filled with intelligence, understanding the weight of the scene unfolding before it. The baby's cries grew louder, the sound of their small voices mixing with the river's rush. The white horse, sensing the urgency, moved forward with graceful determination. Its hooves barely touched the ground as it trotted toward the water, its body cutting through the mist as if it had a purpose beyond just being a mere bystander. Time was running out, and the horse knew that the lives of the two fragile beings now at the mercy of the river depended on its swift actions. The river, cold and indifferent, continued to pull at the basket. The babies inside, shivering and weak, cried out, but there was no one to hear them. The horse, now closer, lowered its head to the water. It nudged the basket with its nose, urging it closer to the shore. The current fought back, but the horse's strength was unmatched. The basket, once at the mercy of the river, slowly began to drift back toward safety, guided by the gentle push of the animal's nose. The horse's determination was unwavering. By the time the sun had risen fully, the mist had begun to lift and the horse, with its precious cargo, had reached the shore. The babies were still alive but barely. Their cries had weakened, their tiny bodies exhausted from the cold. The white horse stood over them, its chest rising and falling with steady breaths, as if it had just completed the most important task of its life. It wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that no one could predict. As the river continued to flow, carrying with it the memory of the man who had cast his children away, the horse turned and walked toward the horizon, its steps slow and deliberate, as if guiding the children toward a future they had no way of knowing. The world around them was still, but inside the heart of the horse, something had shifted. The twins were not just rescued, they were chosen. The river had witnessed the first part of their journey. The next chapter was yet to come. The morning was heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the earth like a veil, muffling the sounds of the world. Along the river's edge, where the trees whispered in the wind, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz hummed as it came to a halt on the narrow dirt road. The engine's hum cut through the silence, a stark contrast to the peaceful stillness of the morning. The driver, a man dressed in a sharp, dark suit, stepped out with an air of cold detachment. His name was Eduardo Montenegro. The wealth that surrounded him, from the polished shoes on his feet to the car that reflected the sun's first light, gave him an aura of power, but there was no warmth in his gaze. He opened the trunk and pulled out a wicker basket, the soft whimpering of newborns barely audible from inside. With a glance around, ensuring no one was nearby, he walked toward the riverbank. His face, usually calm and composed, twitched for a fleeting second. It was as if the weight of the decision was sinking in. He stopped just short of the water, the morning mist curling around his legs. His cold gray eyes locked on the basket, his expression unwavering. The crying grew louder, more desperate, as if the baby sensed the looming danger. Eduardo's gaze remained fixed. Without hesitation, he shoved the basket into the river. The current tugged at it, slowly pulling it away from the shore. He didn't look back as he stepped into his car and drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. There was no remorse, no second thought, just the coldness of a man who saw his offspring as nothing more than a nuisance. What Eduardo didn't see, however, was the white figure in the distance. Hidden behind the dense thicket of trees, a majestic white horse, its coat gleaming like snow in the faint morning light, stood watching. The animal's dark eyes were filled with intelligence, understanding the weight of the scene unfolding before it. The baby's cries grew louder, the sound of their small voices mixing with the river's rush. The white horse, sensing the urgency, moved forward with graceful determination. Its hooves barely touched the ground as it trotted toward the water, its body cutting through the mist as if it had a purpose beyond just being a mere bystander. Time was running out, and the horse knew that the lives of the two fragile beings now at the mercy of the river depended on its swift actions. The river, cold and indifferent, continued to pull at the basket. The babies inside, shivering and weak, cried out, but there was no one to hear them. The horse, now closer, lowered its head to the water. It nudged the basket with its nose, urging it closer to the shore. The current fought back, but the horse's strength was unmatched. The basket, once at the mercy of the river, slowly began to drift back toward safety, guided by the gentle push of the animal's nose. The horse's determination was unwavering. By the time the sun had risen fully, the mist had begun to lift and the horse, with its precious cargo, had reached the shore. The babies were still alive but barely. Their cries had weakened, their tiny bodies exhausted from the cold. The white horse stood over them, its chest rising and falling with steady breaths, as if it had just completed the most important task of its life. It wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that no one could predict. As the river continued to flow, carrying with it the memory of the man who had cast his children away, the horse turned and walked toward the horizon, its steps slow and deliberate, as if guiding the children toward a future they had no way of knowing. The world around them was still, but inside the heart of the horse, something had shifted. The twins were not just rescued, they were chosen. The river had witnessed the first part of their journey. The next chapter was yet to come. As the white horse trotted through the mist, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the scene. Its steps were steady and sure, carrying the babies in the wicker basket on a path that seemed guided by some unseen force. The world was still, but the journey had only just begun. The horse, though clearly magnificent, wasn't merely a creature of beauty, it was a protector, driven by instincts beyond its years. It made its way to the small ranch just beyond the woods where the Santos family lived. Pedro Santos, a man in his early 30s, had worked the land since he was a boy. He and his wife Clara had always dreamed of having children, but fate had other plans. After several heartbreaking losses, they had come to accept that their dream of raising a family would remain just that, a dream. But life, as they would soon learn, had a way of shifting its course. Clara was hanging clothes outside, her brow furrowed with the small worries that came with each day. The sun, though still early, had already begun to warm the earth, and the gentle breeze made the world feel peaceful. She folded a shirt, paused, and glanced up, sensing something was different. Her eyes caught the sight of Luna, the white horse, emerging from the woods. The horse's fur was wet, and its eyes locked with hers in a way that made her stop breathing for a moment. It wasn't just the horse's beauty that was striking, it was the energy it exuded, the urgency in its every movement. With the basket gently clutched in its mouth, the horse trotted toward Clara, its steps slow but determined. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she noticed the faint cries coming from inside the basket. It was a sound she had never expected to hear, babies. She took a cautious step forward, unsure of what was happening but certain that this moment was significant. Pedro, who had been working in the field, heard the movement and quickly came to her side. His strong hands, calloused from years of labor, dropped the tools he had been holding, and his eyes widened in disbelief as he saw the horse with the basket. "What is this?" Pedro asked, his voice thick with confusion. Clara knelt down beside the basket, her hands trembling as she pulled back the layers of cloth. Inside were two tiny babies, still wrapped in the remnants of what seemed to be an old shawl. They were soaked, their faces pale and fragile, but they were alive. The tiny hands of the babies, though weak, reached out for her, their cries desperate but soft. Pedro kneeled beside her, his face full of disbelief and concern. Where did they come from? Who would do such a thing? Clara looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. She had no answers. The babies were cold and weak, and their cries echoed through the silence of the morning. Without thinking, she gathered them into her arms, pulling them close. "We have to help them," she whispered. The white horse, having completed its task, stood back, its head low. It watched Clara with deep, knowing eyes, its body steady and calm. There was no fear in its gaze, only a sense of completion. It had done what it needed to do. And now it would wait. Pedro helped Clara to her feet, his voice soft but filled with urgency. "We need to get them inside. They're too weak." The horse stood at the edge of the field, as if guarding the entrance to their home, its eyes never leaving the family. Clara carried the babies inside, her heart racing, knowing that this moment was the beginning of something far beyond her understanding. Inside, the warm air of the small ranch enveloped the three of them, and Clara quickly set to work, using the knowledge she had gained from her nursing days. She wrapped the babies in blankets and warmed them by the fire, her hands moving swiftly as she worked to revive them. Pedro, still in shock, paced around the room, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Luna, standing just outside the window, stood still as a statue. Its eyes followed every movement inside the house. It knew its task wasn't over yet. Clara glanced up at the window and locked eyes with the horse for a moment, her heart beating faster as the weight of the situation settled in. Something told her that these babies, these precious souls, were meant to be here. And that the horse had brought them for a reason. As she turned back to the babies, she whispered a promise, one that had been made to no one but herself. "I will protect you. No one will hurt you again." The horse stood guard outside, and Clara felt its presence as if it was part of the family already. Unseen but always watching, always protecting. Little did they know, the journey ahead would be fraught with danger, but they would face it together. With the horse's silent strength and Clara and Pedro's unwavering love, the twins would grow into more than just survivors. They would become the key to a story that no one would expect. And so, the path that began with the river and the white horse was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would lead them into the heart of a dangerous secret. Days passed and the twins, Miguel and Gabriel, began to thrive under Clara's care. The small ranch, once filled with only the quiet rhythm of farm life, was now alive with the sounds of two tiny babies. Pedro, though still puzzled by their sudden arrival, grew fond of the twins, his initial shock giving way to a protective instinct he hadn't known he had. The ranch, with its humble walls and modest surroundings, had become their sanctuary, a place where they could heal in peace. But there was something about the twins, something Clara couldn't quite explain, that felt like fate. She couldn't shake the feeling that the babies weren't just a gift but a sign. The memory of Luna's mysterious appearance and the way the horse had led them to safety lingered in her mind, as if the horse knew more than it had let on. One afternoon, as Clara was changing Gabriel's clothes, she noticed something unusual on the fabric of the shawl they had been wrapped in. Hidden in the folds of the blanket was a small, ornate medallion. It was old, with intricate designs carved into the gold. The medallion felt heavy in her hand, and the emblem on it was unfamiliar. The symbol, a crest she had never seen before, looked both regal and ominous. Pedro, who had been working outside, came inside at that moment and Clara, still holding the medallion, showed it to him. His face went pale when he saw the emblem. He had never seen it before, but there was something about it that seemed dangerous. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He took the medallion from her hand and turned it over, inspecting it closely. The emblem was unmistakable, an intricate design that matched the crest of the Montenegro family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the region. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard of the Montenegro family, everyone had. Eduardo Montenegro, the patriarch, was a man whose wealth and influence stretched across the land. He had a reputation for being ruthless, for making enemies disappear, for destroying lives without a second thought. His name alone could bring fear to the hearts of those who lived near him. This medallion belongs to the Montenegros," Pedro said slowly, his voice filled with disbelief. "But how? Why would it be with the babies?" Clara sat down, her mind racing. The twins were no ordinary children. Their arrival had been shrouded in mystery, and now, this connection to the Montenegro family, one of the most dangerous families in the region, was raising more questions than answers. Pedro paced the room, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "There's more to this than we realize, Clara. We have to find out why these babies were left here and who left them. And we need to do it before anyone from the Montenegro family comes looking for them." Clara nodded, her thoughts mirroring Pedro's. She didn't want to believe that anyone would harm these babies, but the reality was that the Montenegro family was not known for their compassion. They were powerful and they protected their own. The babies, she now realized, were connected to a world she had no knowledge of, a world that could change everything. That night, after Pedro had gone to bed, Clara sat alone by the fire. The medallion was in her hands again, its weight pressing down on her like a secret that needed to be uncovered. She had to know more about this symbol, about why the Montenegro family had left their mark on the babies. She couldn't rest until she had answers. The next morning, Clara and Pedro decided to take the medallion into town. The small village nearby was where they did most of their shopping, and it was also where many of the older residents lived. Among them was Dona Benita, an elderly woman known for her wisdom and knowledge of the region's history. Clara trusted her and hoped she could shed some light on the mysterious emblem. As they walked to Dona Benita's house, Clara's heart was heavy with the weight of what they were about to uncover. The medallion felt like a link to something much bigger than the life they had known. Dona Benita's home was tucked away on the outskirts of the village, a small cottage surrounded by an overgrown garden. When Clara and Pedro arrived, the old woman greeted them warmly, her eyes sharp despite her age. Clara showed her the medallion, and Dona Benita's face immediately changed. Her usually gentle expression hardened as she inspected the emblem. This, Dona Benita's voice faltered for a moment. This is the crest of the Montenegro family. It is said to be a symbol of great power and wealth, but there are dark stories about it too. You see, the Montenegros are not just rich, they are involved in many things that people don't talk about. Things that should remain buried. Clara felt her heart skip a beat. What do you mean, Dona Benita? What are these dark stories? Dona Benita sighed deeply, her hands trembling as she set the medallion down on the table. Years ago, Elena Montenegro, Eduardo's mother, was a kind woman. She loved music and would often come to play the piano at my house. But she was trapped in a world of her husband's making, a world that would stop at nothing to preserve their legacy. Elena once confided in me that she was planning to leave Eduardo's father, but she never got the chance. Pedro looked at the old woman, his voice low. What happened to her? Dona Benita's eyes filled with sorrow. She died. It was no accident, though. Some say Eduardo had a hand in it, but it was covered up, as many things are when it comes to power and money. She was a mother who tried to protect her children from the world she was trapped in. But her children, Miguel and Gabriel, are the legacy she left behind. And this medallion. Dona Benita's voice trailed off as she glanced at the emblem again. It's more than just a family heirloom. It's a marker. A sign that these babies are more important than anyone realizes. Clara's blood ran cold as Dona Benita's words sank in. The babies were not just innocent victims, they were part of a much larger story, a story that had been hidden for years. Clara's hands trembled as she held the medallion, now understanding that the babies were tied to something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The weight of their legacy seemed to press down on her, and for the first time since their arrival, Clara began to realize the true danger they were in. The Montenegro family was not just a wealthy dynasty, they were a family steeped in secrets, and the babies were the key to unlocking them. Dona Benita sat quietly, her eyes locked on the emblem as if she were recalling a time long past. Pedro too seemed lost in thought, his face tight with worry. He knew, as did Clara, that they could no longer simply live in peace, tending to their modest ranch and caring for the twins. Eduardo Montenegro was a powerful man, and the fact that his children had been left on their doorstep meant one thing. Someone was watching them. Dona Benita, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, what do we do now? We can't just keep the babies here if the Montenegro family is looking for them. The old woman sighed, her weathered face filled with sorrow. The Montenegro family has always had a way of controlling things. Eduardo's father, though long gone, built an empire of influence and fear. Eduardo, unfortunately, learned well from his father. But I believe Elena, his mother, had a plan. She knew her children would be in danger, and that's why she left them with you, whether you realize it or not. Clara frowned, confused. You mean? Elena knew the danger, and she chose us to protect them? Dona Benita nodded slowly. Yes. Elena always believed in the goodness of people, in the kind of love and care that people like you, Clara and Pedro, offer. She trusted you in a way that she never trusted her own family. This medallion, the crest, it's a symbol of her last act of defiance against the Montenegro dynasty. Pedro stepped forward, his voice urgent. What was Elena planning to do? If she was trying to protect them, why didn't she do more? Dona Benita's expression grew even more somber. Elena was planning to escape with the twins. She knew what kind of man Eduardo was becoming, and she feared that he would never let them go. There was a hidden will, one that would give the twins everything that was rightfully theirs, the inheritance, the land, and the future that Eduardo had stolen from them. But before she could act on it, she was silenced. Clara felt a chill run through her at the thought. So, Eduardo's mother had everything planned, but she never got to carry it out. And now, the babies are the key to everything, his power, his wealth, his legacy. But it's all built on lies and manipulation. Pedro clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger. We can't let him get his hands on them. We need to protect them, no matter what it costs. Dona Benita looked up at them with a glint of determination in her eyes. You must understand this, Clara and Pedro. Eduardo will stop at nothing to get his children back. They are not just heirs to his fortune. They are the key to his legacy, the very thing he wants to control. And if he learns that you are keeping them from him, he will destroy everything in his path. Clara sat down heavily, her mind racing. Then what do we do? How do we protect them from someone like Eduardo? The old woman's voice was calm but firm as she spoke. You have to be smart. You cannot hide them forever. There are too many eyes, too many people watching. But there is one person who can help you, someone who knows the truth about Elena's plan. Someone who might be able to protect you, but you must act quickly. Pedro raised an eyebrow. Who? Beatriz, Dona Benita said, her eyes narrowing. Eduardo's sister. She's the one person in the Montenegro family who doesn't share her brother's bloodlust. She's always known the truth about Elena, and she has always had doubts about her brother's methods. But she's also trapped in a world of her own making. Her loyalty to her family, her fear of Eduardo. If you can find a way to reach her, she may be the key to keeping the twins safe. Clara's heart sank as she thought about the risk. But how do we find her? Eduardo controls everything. He'll know if we try to contact her. Dona Benita nodded. Yes, he will. But Beatriz is different. She will listen. She has her own reasons for helping you, reasons you don't yet know. But you must be careful. Do not trust anyone else. Eduardo's spies are everywhere. Pedro looked at Clara, then back at Dona Benita. We'll find a way. We have to. The old woman smiled gently, though her eyes held a trace of sadness. Beatriz can help you, but she cannot do it alone. You must stand united. Protect the babies, protect your family, and be prepared for whatever comes. Clara took a deep breath, the weight of her new responsibility settling over her. She wasn't just a mother now, she was part of a bigger story, one that had been set into motion long before she had ever met these babies. The days of quiet farm life were over. The stakes were higher now than they could have ever imagined. But there was no turning back. The twins were their responsibility, and they would fight to the end to protect them. The days that followed felt like a quiet storm brewing on the horizon. Clara and Pedro kept to their routines, but their minds were no longer at ease. The medallion, now tucked away safely in Clara's drawer, weighed heavily on both of them. They knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Eduardo's eyes would eventually find them. The question was, how long could they keep the babies safe? And more importantly, how could they trust anyone outside their small circle? The thought of Beatriz lingered in Clara's mind. The woman who could be the key to everything, yet the same woman who belonged to the very family they feared most. Clara felt a deep sense of unease. How could they trust someone with so much power, especially when that person's loyalty was so divided? But Dona Benita was right. If they didn't reach Beatriz, they would have no chance against Eduardo's wrath. Clara knew they had no choice. They would have to find her. Pedro was the first to suggest the idea of going to the village's weekly market, known as the Tianguis. It was a small event, a gathering of local farmers, traders, and villagers. A place where the community came together to buy and sell goods, exchange news, and gossip. It was also a place where they might find Beatriz, or at least hear something about her. That Saturday morning, Pedro and Clara set out early, the babies sleeping peacefully in their arms as they made their way to the market. The air was thick with the smell of fresh produce, and the sounds of lively chatter filled the streets. The market was bustling with activity, yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but she didn't see anyone who looked like Beatriz. There were people everywhere, but none of them seemed to stand out. They made their way through the market, trying to blend in, but Clara's heart raced. The thought of encountering someone from the Montenegro family, or worse, Eduardo's spies, kept her on edge. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, uncertainty, and fear. What if Beatriz wasn't here? What if they were walking into a trap? Pedro, sensing her unease, took her hand gently. We're doing the right thing, Clara. We have to find her. We'll be careful. Clara nodded, though she couldn't silence the fear that gripped her. As they passed a small herbal stall near the center of the market, Clara's gaze landed on an older woman, dressed in simple clothes, with graying hair tied up in a neat bun. She had a presence that was both unassuming and strong. And there, sitting next to her, was a woman who caught Clara's attention instantly. The woman wore a simple blue dress and a wide-brimmed hat, but it was the brooch she wore, a small delicate butterfly, that made Clara's heart skip a beat. It was the same brooch Donna Benita had described, the one Beatriz always wore. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Beatriz was here. Pedro noticed her sudden stillness and turned to follow her gaze. He too saw the woman with the brooch. Is that her? He asked quietly, his voice filled with both hope and caution. Clara nodded, her heart racing. I think so. They moved slowly toward the stall, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Beatriz was talking with the elderly woman, exchanging some herbs for a few coins. Her voice was calm and measured, but Clara noticed a tension in the way she held herself, an alertness as if she were always aware of her surroundings. She was, after all, part of a family that controlled everything in the region. She had to be cautious. As they approached the stall, Clara hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. Excuse me, she said, her voice tentative but firm. Beatriz turned to face her, her eyes scanning Clara quickly before softening. The recognition in Beatriz's eyes was immediate. She knew who Clara was and she knew why she was there. Clara didn't waste any time. We need to talk, she said softly, her voice just above a whisper. It's about the twins. Beatriz's expression shifted in an instant. She stood up quickly, a flash of concern passing over her face. She glanced around the market as if making sure no one was listening before nodding toward the back of the stall. Follow me, she said, her voice low. They moved to a quieter part of the market, away from the crowds, where Beatriz led them to a small alley behind a row of shops. The moment they were alone, she spoke again, her voice filled with urgency. What are you doing with the children? She asked, her tone softer now but still filled with caution. Clara explained everything, their discovery of the babies by the river, the medallion, and Donna Benita's revelations. Beatriz listened carefully, her expression unreadable. When Clara finished, Beatriz's eyes lingered on her for a long moment. You've made a brave decision, she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. But you're in much greater danger than you realize. Eduardo won't stop. If he learns you have his children, he will destroy everything. I've seen him do worse. Clara's heart sank. What can we do? How can we stop him? Beatriz sighed heavily, her gaze distant. There's only one way to keep them safe. You'll need to leave. Leave this place and never look back. Eduardo's spies are everywhere and he will find you if you stay here. But there's a place, an old house outside the city near the mountains. It's hidden and it's the only place Eduardo won't think to look. I can get you there, but you'll need to move quickly. Pedro looked at Beatriz with suspicion. Why are you helping us? You're part of that family. What if this is a trap? Beatriz's gaze hardened. I may be a part of that family, but I'm not like them. I've seen what they've done. I've had enough. Helping you is my chance to do what's right. Clara felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly followed by the crushing weight of the decision before them. We'll do whatever it takes, she said, her voice steady. We'll go to the house. But we need your help. You're the only one who can keep them safe. Beatriz nodded solemnly. I'll get you there, but you need to trust me. You can't look back. Eduardo won't stop until he has them. As they turned to leave, Clara glanced over her shoulder at the busy market, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their lives were about to change forever. And yet, in that moment, Clara knew one thing for sure. The babies were safe for now. The path ahead would be dangerous, but she and Pedro would fight for them no matter the cost. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the town as Clara, Pedro, and Beatriz moved quickly through the winding streets. The weight of the decision they had made hung heavily in the air, each step leading them further into the unknown. The world around them seemed peaceful, too peaceful, but Clara knew that within hours their lives would be completely transformed. They couldn't go back. Eduardo would stop at nothing to get his children back, and if they stayed they would never be safe. Beatriz led them through back alleys and quiet streets, always keeping a watchful eye over her shoulder. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. There was no turning back now. She glanced down at the babies wrapped securely in blankets, their small faces pressed against her chest, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them. Pedro walked beside her, his jaw clenched with determination. They had to protect them no matter what. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of walking, Beatriz stopped at a small, inconspicuous house on the outskirts of town. It was hidden from view by overgrown shrubs and trees, the type of place that would never draw attention. Beatriz turned to them and gave a quick nod. This is it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll stay here for the night. Tomorrow we'll leave at dawn. Clara glanced around, taking in the small house with its faded paint and the dense forest behind it. It felt safe for now. But Clara knew better than to let her guard down. Eduardo could be anywhere, and Beatrice's warning still echoed in her mind. They had to be ready for anything. Is this house safe? Pedro asked, his voice low but filled with suspicion. Beatrice nodded, her expression serious. It's been abandoned for years. No one comes here. Eduardo has no reason to look for you here. Clara felt a fleeting sense of relief. But as they stepped inside the house, the reality of their situation set in once again. The house was empty with only the bare essentials. A few old chairs, a dusty table, and a fireplace. It was far from a comfortable place to stay, but it would have to do. Pedro went to the window and peered out, scanning the surrounding area. The quiet of the night was unsettling. They were far from the market, but still, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. We can't stay here long, Pedro said, his voice tight with concern. I don't trust this place. Eduardo will find us if we're not careful. Beatrice, who had been pacing the room, stopped and turned to them. We don't have much time. Tomorrow I'll take you to the hidden house in the mountains. It's the only place where you'll be safe from Eduardo and his men. Clara nodded, though her mind was racing. She couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into another trap. But there was no choice. They had to keep moving forward. For the twins. We'll leave at dawn, Beatrice continued, her voice calm but urgent. But for tonight you need to rest. You can't think clearly if you're exhausted. Clara and Pedro exchanged a glance, both of them torn between the need to stay alert and the overwhelming exhaustion that had settled in their bones. The weight of the day, the fear, the uncertainty, was taking its toll. Clara slowly sat down in one of the old chairs, holding the babies close to her chest. They were sound asleep now, their tiny breaths soft and steady. Clara couldn't help but marvel at how innocent they were, how unaware of the danger that hovered over their heads. They had no idea that their lives had already been mapped out for them, that they were the center of a dangerous game being played by powerful people. As she gazed down at the babies, a deep sense of protectiveness washed over her. She would do anything to keep them safe. She had promised herself that from the moment she first held them in her arms. Pedro sat down next to her, his eyes scanning the room one last time. We'll get them to safety. No matter what happens. Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. We have to. They're our responsibility now. The silence in the room felt suffocating, but there was a quiet strength in it as well. For the first time since they found the babies by the river, Clara felt like they were on the right path. They had a plan and they had each other. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The escape to the mountains would be dangerous. Eduardo would not let them go easily. They would have to be quick, careful, and, above all, united. As the night wore on, Clara tried to sleep, though the uncertainty of the coming days kept her awake. She could hear the faint sounds of the wind rustling the trees outside, but it wasn't enough to lull her into sleep. Her mind raced with plans and contingencies, weighing every possible outcome. Beatrice had given them a chance, but it felt like a fleeting one. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into something much bigger than they had realized. The Montenegro family was powerful, and no one could predict what Eduardo would do next. The night passed slowly, each moment dragging on with the weight of what lay ahead. Clara lay awake on the hard floor, her thoughts swirling like the wind outside. Pedro slept beside her, but his restless tossing and turning told her he, too, was struggling to find peace. The twins, Miguel and Gabriel, lay nestled in her arms, their tiny bodies warm and safe, but Clara couldn't escape the nagging feeling that their safety was an illusion. The next morning arrived with a cloudless sky, the sun casting its light over the landscape in a way that seemed too peaceful for the storm brewing in their lives. Clara and Pedro were ready, though the uncertainty in their hearts made it hard to fully prepare for the journey ahead. They ate a simple breakfast, bread and cheese, hastily prepared before they gathered their things. Beatrice was already waiting outside, her presence as calm and composed as ever. But Clara noticed the worry hidden behind her eyes, the same unease that Clara had felt the night before. The path will be treacherous, Beatrice said, her voice low and serious. We need to move fast but quietly. Eduardo's men are everywhere, and they won't hesitate to stop at nothing to find the babies. Clara nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they were about to enter a dangerous game. She glanced down at the twins, now wrapped in their blankets, their faces peaceful in their sleep. They had no idea what was happening around them, and Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of sorrow for them. They had been born into a world of wealth and power, but it was a world that cared little for their safety. Pedro adjusted the pack on his back and looked at Clara, his expression a mix of determination and concern. We can't waste any more time, he said. We have to keep moving. They made their way down the narrow path leading away from the house, keeping their steps as quiet as possible. Beatrice led the way, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest, constantly on alert. Clara and Pedro followed closely behind, each step taking them farther from the life they had known and deeper into the unknown. The journey was grueling. The path was rough, winding through thick woods and over steep hills. Clara's legs ached with each step, but she pushed herself forward, determined to keep going for the sake of the babies. The weight of the medallion, hidden deep in her bag, seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. As they walked, Clara found herself lost in thought. She couldn't stop thinking about Eduardo, about the man who had so callously discarded his children, his own flesh and blood. What kind of person could do something like that? And what would he do if he found out the twins were still alive? She glanced at Beatrice walking ahead, her movements fluid and quiet. There was something about Beatrice that Clara couldn't fully understand. She had helped them, yes, but why? Was she truly on their side, or was there something more to her involvement that Clara hadn't yet uncovered? Beatrice's voice broke through her thoughts. We're almost there. Just keep close. Clara nodded and quickened her pace to match Beatrice's. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The forest had grown quieter, and Clara felt a sense of unease creeping over her. They were nearing the mountains, the last stretch of their journey. The air was cooler here, the scent of pine and earth filling her lungs with every breath. It was a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the town they had left behind. We'll rest for the night once we reach the old cabin, Beatrice said, her voice steady. There's a hidden passage that will take us the rest of the way to the mountains. From there, we'll be able to lay low until the situation clears up. Clara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest around them was silent now, almost too quiet. It felt as though the world itself had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. They reached the cabin just as the last light of day was fading. The small, weathered building stood against the backdrop of the darkening sky, its wooden structure half hidden by overgrown vines and thick bushes. It looked abandoned, a relic of a time long past. Beatrice led them inside, her movements swift and efficient. The inside of the cabin was sparse, with only a few old pieces of furniture covered in dust. It was dark, save for the light filtering through the cracks in the walls. But Clara felt a sense of relief wash over her as they entered. This place, though not much, was safe for now. We'll stay here for the night, Beatrice said, closing the door behind them. Tomorrow we continue. But we need to be ready. Eduardo is relentless. Clara sat down near the window, her gaze fixed on the darkening landscape outside. The tension in her chest hadn't loosened. In fact, it felt like it was only growing tighter. She knew that the safety they had found here was temporary. Soon they would have to face whatever Eduardo had in store for them. The sound of the twins' soft breaths filled the cabin as they slept peacefully in Clara's arms. She kissed the top of their heads, a gesture of comfort she wished she could offer them more of. They didn't deserve this world, this danger. But Clara knew that she had no choice but to fight for them. Pedro sat beside her, his face weary from the journey but filled with determination. We can't let them take the babies, he said, his voice low. We'll get them through this. We'll do whatever it takes. Clara nodded. I know. We'll protect them. The night was still, the only sounds the occasional rustle of the wind outside and the soft flickering of the cabin's fire. But Clara's mind was far from calm. As the hours stretched on, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The true test was yet to come. The night passed slowly, and though Clara tried to sleep, her mind refused to quiet. She lay on the cold wooden floor, her body exhausted but her mind racing. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, its mournful cry creeping into the cabin through the cracks in the walls. The darkness outside seemed endless, but it was the quiet within that unsettled her the most. Pedro slept beside her, his breathing slow and steady, but Clara couldn't find rest. She kept thinking about the path ahead, the danger that loomed over them with each step. Eduardo's power was vast, and if he learned they had his children, there would be no escaping his wrath. The twins, Miguel and Gabriel, slept peacefully in her arms, unaware of the chaos that had already begun to swirl around them. Clara could only hold them tighter, trying to protect them from a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. Hours passed before Clara finally rose, unable to stay still any longer. She quietly moved to the window, peering out into the dark forest. The trees swayed with the wind, and the occasional flicker of lightning illuminated the sky. But it was the silence that unsettled her. There was an eerie stillness to the night, as if the world was holding its breath. Suddenly she heard it, footsteps. Faint but distinct, crunching against the dry leaves outside. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Could be nothing, just the wind playing tricks. But something told her it wasn't. She turned to Pedro, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pedro, wake up. There's someone outside." Pedro stirred, his eyes flickering open as he sat up quickly, his hand instinctively going to the makeshift weapon they had found earlier in the cabin, a blunt piece of wood. Clara's heart raced. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice sharp with urgency. Clara moved silently to the door, her senses heightened. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be discreet. They were getting closer with every passing second. Beatrice stirred in the corner, her eyes snapping open. Without a word, she stood and moved toward the back of the cabin, signaling for Clara and Pedro to follow her. They knew they had no time to waste. The footsteps grew louder, now accompanied by voices, low, urgent voices murmuring in the distance. Beatrice held up a hand, signaling them to stop. She moved to the back of the cabin, pulling aside a heavy, rotting piece of wood from the floor. Beneath it was a trapdoor, its hinges creaking as she pulled it open. The dim light from the cabin barely illuminated the dark space below. "We have to go," Beatrice urged, her face grim. "Now." Clara's heart was pounding in her chest as she glanced at Pedro, then back to the trapdoor. She could hear the voices outside, the sounds of the approaching men. They were getting closer, but there was no time to hesitate. Pedro helped Clara lower herself down into the dark passage first, then took the babies from her arms. Beatrice followed quickly, and once they were all inside, she closed the trapdoor behind them with a soft thud, muffling the sound of their descent. The underground passage was narrow and damp, the air heavy with the scent of earth. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the small lantern Beatrice had brought with her. The walls were cold and damp, and the ground was uneven, making every step feel like a journey into the unknown. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Clara could hear the muffled voices of the men outside, but they sounded far away now, as if they were searching the cabin above. Beatrice led the way, her movements sure and silent, as though she had walked these passages countless times before. They walked for what felt like hours, the passage twisting and turning in ways that made Clara lose all sense of direction. Every step they took them farther from the cabin and closer to whatever lay ahead. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. But through it all, Clara kept her focus on the twins, their tiny forms nestled in her arms, safe for now. Finally, Beatrice stopped, her voice low but urgent. "We're almost there." Ahead, the passage opened into a small chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, and there were crates and old furniture scattered about. It looked like a forgotten storage space hidden away beneath the earth. But Clara could sense there was more to it than that. Beatrice moved toward a wall at the far end of the room, her hands working quickly to uncover a hidden door. "This is the way," Beatrice said, her voice barely audible in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading upward. Clara's heart raced. They were so close. The stairs would take them out of the darkness and into the unknown once again. They ascended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the confined space. The tension in the air was thick, and Clara could feel the weight of every second pressing down on her. Finally they reached the top and Beatrice pushed open a wooden door. The outside world greeted them, cold, silent, and still. They had emerged into a dense forest, the trees heavy with the weight of the evening fog. The sun had long since set, and the world around them was nothing but shadows. Beatrice glanced around, scanning the area for any sign of movement. When she was sure it was safe, she motioned for them to follow. "This way," she whispered, moving swiftly through the trees. As they walked deeper into the forest, Clara couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, her mind still racing with the events of the night. Eduardo's men were close, and Clara knew they wouldn't stop. The storm was just beginning, and it was one they would have to face head-on. But for now they were safe, at least for tonight. The forest was dense, the trees thick with age, their branches intertwined like the fingers of giants. The fog that had lingered in the air seemed to settle in the woods, wrapping everything in an eerie hush. The only sounds were the soft crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor and the distant rustling of the wind through the leaves. Clara kept her eyes straight ahead, trying not to think about the men who could be following them, could be anywhere. Pedro walked just ahead of her, his body tense, every muscle on high alert. The babies were still sleeping, oblivious to the danger that clung to them like a second skin. Clara's heart was heavy with worry, but she tried not to let it show. They had to stay strong for the twins. They had to keep moving. Beatrice led them through the trees, her steps swift and sure. Clara couldn't help but notice how comfortable Beatrice seemed in the woods, as though she knew these paths as well as her own home. And perhaps she did. But Clara couldn't afford to trust her completely. Beatrice had helped them, yes, but she was still a Montenegro. The family that had caused so much harm. The family that had cast these babies aside without a second thought. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. The trees parted, revealing a small, hidden cabin. It was tucked away in the shadows, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The cabin was old, weathered by time, but it stood strong, a silent sentinel in the middle of the woods. It looked like a place forgotten by the world. "This is it," Beatrice said, turning to face them. "This is where we'll stay for now." Clara's eyes scanned the area, her senses heightened. The clearing was peaceful, serene even, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her hand instinctively tightened around the blanket that held the twins. But as she looked around, all she could see were the trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Pedro gave her a reassuring glance. "It looks safe," he said, his voice calm but wary. Beatrice stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the cabin door. "It is. For now, this is the safest place for you and the children. No one will find you here. Not unless they know where to look." The door creaked as Beatrice pushed it open, revealing a small interior. The cabin was sparse but functional, rough-hewn furniture, a stone fireplace, and a few shelves filled with dried herbs and blankets. There was a small table in the corner, and a simple cot in the farthest corner of the room. Clara stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a place to rest, to regroup, to plan their next move. She set the twins down gently on the cot, the weight of their small bodies grounding her in the moment. They were safe for now. Pedro closed the door behind them and secured it with a thick wooden bar. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The kind of silence that came before a storm. Beatrice moved toward the fireplace, pulling a few logs from the pile in the corner. As she knelt down to start the fire, she spoke again, her voice low. "We can't stay here long. The house is hidden, but we're not the only ones who know these woods. Eduardo's men will search for you. They'll search until they find you." Clara swallowed hard, her thoughts immediately going to the twins. "How long do we have?" she asked. Beatrice paused, her back to them as she worked to light the fire. "A few days maybe. But no more. Eduardo's reach is long. And he won't stop until he has them back." Clara's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It was too dangerous here. They needed to move again, to find a place far away where Eduardo's men wouldn't think to look. But where could they go? How could they stay ahead of someone like him? Pedro seemed to read her mind. "We can't keep running forever," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the same worry that Clara felt. "We need to fight back. We need a plan." Beatrice stood up, the fire crackling to life in front of her. She turned to face them, her expression serious. "I can help you," she said, her tone quiet but resolute. "But you need to trust me. If you don't, you'll be putting yourselves, and the babies, in even more danger." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Trust. That word had never been so heavy. She had trusted Beatrice with their lives already, but now, as the reality of their situation set in, Clara couldn't help but feel a deep sense of hesitation. Pedro spoke up first. "What do you have in mind?" Beatrice's eyes were sharp, calculating. "I can get you to a safe place. A place where Eduardo can't reach you. But it won't be easy. We'll need to move quickly and we'll need to be careful. No one can know where we're going." Clara and Pedro exchanged a look. It felt like their only option, but the risk was immense. Beatrice was offering them a lifeline, but the question remained, could they trust her completely? As if reading her thoughts, Beatrice spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I know this is hard. I know you don't trust me. But right now, I'm the only one who can help you. If you want to keep the baby safe, you need to follow my lead." Clara nodded slowly, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know what the future held, but for the sake of the twins, she would do whatever it took. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "We'll follow you." Beatrice gave a single nod, her eyes meeting Clara's. "Then we leave at dawn." The night fell quiet again, the only sound the crackling of the fire. But Clara's mind was far from peaceful. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to step into a storm far worse than anything they had faced so far. The cabin was eerily quiet, the soft crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the silence. Clara sat by the fire, her arms wrapped tightly around the twins, trying to absorb everything that had happened in such a short time. The world outside felt distant, like a different life altogether, and she longed for the peace of the life they once knew. But that life was gone. The moment the babies had entered her arms, everything had changed. Beatrice's words echoed in her mind, her offer to guide them to safety both a lifeline and a heavy burden. Clara didn't know if she could trust Beatrice fully, but right now she was their only hope. The decision to trust her would shape everything that followed. Pedro stood by the door, his eyes scanning the dense forest outside, ever watchful. Clara knew that he too was struggling with the weight of the situation. He had always been protective, but this was different. This was survival. "They'll come for us," Pedro said, his voice low but filled with a quiet certainty. "Eduardo won't let us go this easily. If we keep running, he'll find us." Clara didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. She didn't know the answer. She had always believed that running, hiding, was the answer. But now, after everything they had learned, after seeing the power Eduardo held, Clara wasn't sure. Could they really outrun him forever? Beatrice, who had been sitting in the corner with her thoughts, turned to face them. "Eduardo will come. But the question is, what will you do when he does? You can keep running, yes. But if you don't take control, if you don't find a way to stop him, then you'll be running forever. The babies deserve more than that." Clara's heart tightened at her words. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about fighting back, reclaiming what was rightfully the babies' and, by extension, their own. "Do you have a plan?" Pedro asked, his voice steady. "If we're going to fight, then we need to know what we're up against." Beatrice stood, her eyes locking with theirs. "The first thing we need to do is find out where Eduardo is. He's not just some distant threat, he's controlling everything from the shadows. But there's a way to disrupt him, a way to weaken his power." Clara's curiosity piqued, but she also felt a knot in her stomach. The Montenegro family was a web of deception, lies, and corruption, and Clara wasn't sure how deep that web went. What could Beatrice possibly know that could change their fate? "Tell us," Clara said, her voice firm but laced with apprehension. Beatrice took a step forward, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. "There's a ledger. It contains everything, Eduardo's dealings, his assets, the dirty business that no one talks about. If we can get our hands on it, it would destroy him. But it's locked away, hidden behind the walls of his estate. We need to get inside. And that's not going to be easy." Pedro's eyes narrowed. "How do we even get close to his estate without being seen?" Beatrice paused, her face clouded with thought. "I've been there before. I know the layout, the guards, the paths they take. I've seen the ledger, but it's not something you can steal without help. It's hidden in a private vault, a place where only Eduardo and his closest allies can access." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. This was getting more dangerous by the minute. Stealing from Eduardo's estate with everything he had riding on it? It felt almost impossible. But what choice did they have? "We don't have much time," Beatrice continued. "The longer we wait, the more likely it is that he'll catch on. But if we get that ledger, we can expose him. We can turn everything around for the twins, for all of us." Clara's mind raced. This wasn't just about keeping the baby safe anymore. It was about taking back control, about showing that they wouldn't be pushed around by a man like Eduardo. The fear of facing him head-on was real, but so was the sense of determination that began to spark within her. "We'll do it," Clara said, her voice steady. She didn't know if they were making the right choice, but she knew they had no other option. "We'll get the ledger." Pedro turned to her, his face a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You're sure?" Clara nodded. "We have to. We can't keep running. We have to stop him before he does more damage, before he takes everything." Beatrice gave a nod of approval, but her expression was serious. "This won't be easy. We'll need to move quickly and we'll need help. But we can't do it alone." Clara turned to Pedro, seeing the same resolve in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. Together they had already faced so much. They could face this too. "Who can we trust?" Pedro asked, his voice full of caution. Beatrice's eyes darkened. "I have a few allies, but they're few and far between. We'll need to be careful about who we involve. Eduardo has eyes everywhere. If anyone knows where the ledger is, it's someone in his circle. We just need to get to them before he does." The night stretched on as they discussed the plan, each word heavy with the realization of what they were about to do. They were stepping into the lion's den and they knew it. But there was no turning back. As Clara lay back down on the floor, her body heavy with exhaustion, she glanced over at the twins, still sleeping peacefully beside her. They had no idea what was happening, but Clara made a silent vow to them. They would have a future. A safe one. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within their lives was just beginning. The morning arrived with a chill that seemed to settle into their bones, the air heavy with the weight of the decisions that had been made the night before. Clara, Pedro, and Beatrice stood at the edge of the forest, the hidden cabin now far behind them. The path ahead was uncertain, but their resolve was clear. They had to move quickly. The longer they waited, the more time Eduardo had to track them down. They were no longer just trying to survive, they were fighting for their future and for the future of the twins. Beatriz led them down a narrow, winding path through the woods. The trees grew denser as they moved further into the wilderness, and Clara's heart raced with the feeling of being watched. Every crack of a twig, every rustling leaf, made her jump. She knew they had to be careful, but she couldn't shake the fear that Eduardo's reach was long, that the people he had sent after them were closer than they thought. They walked in silence, the tension thick in the air. Beatriz's face was set in a mask of concentration, her every movement calculated, as though she were preparing for something far more dangerous than just a journey. Clara couldn't help but wonder just how many times Beatriz had been through these woods, how many times she had led someone down this path, and whether any of them had made it back. After several hours of walking, the dense forest gave way to a small clearing, and in the distance, Clara saw the outline of a large estate. The sight of it made her blood run cold. This was it, the place where it all began, the heart of Eduardo's power. The estate loomed ahead, surrounded by high stone walls, the iron gates standing tall and imposing. The structure itself was magnificent, a sprawling mansion with windows that seemed to glint in the sunlight, an imposing symbol of wealth and control. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how far-reaching Eduardo's influence had become. This wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. And they were about to walk straight into the lion's den. "We need to move quickly," Beatriz whispered, her voice low but urgent. "We can't get too close until nightfall. Once we get inside, we'll need to find the ledger. It's locked away in the vault beneath the estate. Only a few people know about it, Eduardo, his closest allies, and me. But getting in will be tricky." Clara nodded, trying to steady her breath. The plan had seemed simple enough in theory: infiltrate the estate, find the ledger, and expose Eduardo's secrets. But standing at the edge of the estate, the enormity of the task ahead seemed overwhelming. "We can do this," Pedro said, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a quiet strength that steadied her. "We don't have a choice." Beatriz motioned for them to move closer to the estate, but they kept to the shadows, staying out of sight of any guards that might be patrolling the area. The tall stone walls were intimidating, but Beatriz knew the way in. She had a plan, and they would have to follow it to the letter if they were to have any hope of succeeding. As they made their way toward a smaller, unguarded side entrance, Clara couldn't help but feel a wave of unease. This was it. They were about to enter Eduardo's world, his domain where every corner was watched, every movement scrutinized. It felt like they were walking into a spider's web, each step bringing them closer to the center of the trap. They reached the side entrance just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Beatriz pushed open a small weathered door that creaked in protest. They slipped inside quickly, and Clara's eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The passageway they entered was narrow, the air thick with dust. They moved quietly, every footstep measured and cautious. Beatriz led the way through the corridors of the estate, her movements smooth and practiced. Clara couldn't help but be amazed by how well Beatriz knew the layout of the place. It was as if she had lived here her entire life, as if she was still part of the family despite everything she had told them. They passed through several rooms, each more lavish than the last. The wealth of the Montenegro family was apparent in every detail. Rich tapestries on the walls, polished marble floors, antique furniture that gleamed in the low light. It was a world of excess, a world that felt foreign to Clara, a stark contrast to the life she had known. Eventually, Beatriz stopped in front of a thick wooden door. "This is it," she whispered. "The vault is behind this door. We'll need to get inside without being seen." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The vault. The key to Eduardo's downfall, and yet the key to their own survival. If they could get to it, if they could expose everything Eduardo had hidden, it could change everything. But they had no time to waste. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that someone would find them. Beatriz turned to Clara and Pedro, her expression tense. "We can't hesitate," she said. "Once we're inside, we'll have to move quickly. I'll handle the lock, but you'll need to keep watch. If anyone comes, we won't have time to explain. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, her stomach in knots. There was no turning back now. This was their only shot. Beatriz moved forward, pulling a small tool from her pocket and carefully working on the lock. The seconds stretched into minutes as Clara and Pedro stood guard, their eyes scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. The sound of the lock clicking open made Clara's heart skip a beat. "We're in," Beatriz whispered. The vault door creaked open, revealing rows of shelves stacked with paperwork and boxes, the weight of secrets hidden within. But Clara's eyes immediately locked onto the far corner, where a small metal box sat on a pedestal. The ledger. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The moment that could change everything. But she knew that time was running out. Eduardo would be looking for them, and if they didn't act fast, they'd be caught. With trembling hands, Beatrice moved to the box, her fingers shaking as she unlocked it. As she opened the lid, the weight of the moment settled over them. Clara's gaze locked on the pages of the ledger, its contents hidden from view but filled with the potential to destroy Eduardo's empire. This was their chance. This was the moment they had been waiting for. But in the distance, Clara could hear the sound of footsteps. Footsteps that were getting closer. Clara's heart raced as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Her eyes locked onto Beatrice, who was still kneeling by the box, slowly flipping through the pages of the ledger. It was a moment of triumph, yes, but also one of panic. They had found it. They had found the key to bringing down Eduardo Montenegro. But now there was no time left. The footsteps were unmistakable. Guards. Clara's instincts kicked in. Beatrice, hurry, she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. She could see the fear in Beatrice's eyes, but also something else, a fierce determination. Beatrice had made this decision long ago, had chosen to help them. She wasn't about to back out now. Beatrice's fingers moved faster, flipping through the pages of the ledger. She found the section she was looking for, her eyes scanning the contents with quick precision. Clara couldn't help but wonder what exactly she was reading, what pieces of Eduardo's world she was about to expose. But there was no time to ask. Pedro, who had been standing guard by the door, suddenly tensed. "We've got company," he muttered under his breath. "They're close." Clara felt a surge of panic. It was too late. They had been discovered. Eduardo's men were coming. "Beatrice now," Clara urged, her voice barely a whisper. Beatrice nodded and slammed the ledger shut. She placed it carefully back in the box, then locked it again. The sound of the key turning in the lock felt like a thunderclap in the otherwise still room. The footsteps were getting closer. There was no more time for hesitation. "Clara, Pedro," Beatrice said in a low, steady voice, "we need to move. Now." She quickly grabbed the box containing the ledger and slipped it into her bag, then stood, motioning for Clara and Pedro to follow her. They moved swiftly through the dark vault, their feet barely making a sound as they made their way back to the door. Just as Beatrice reached the door, the unmistakable sound of voices drifted into the room, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of a key in the lock. The guards were getting closer. "Go," Beatrice whispered, pushing Clara and Pedro through the door and back into the hallway. They had to get out of there. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible through the estate's darkened halls, their bodies tense, their hearts pounding in their chests. Clara's thoughts raced, but there was only one thing on her mind now: escape. They had what they came for. The ledger. The evidence that could bring down Eduardo. Now they just had to make it out alive. The three of them hurried down the long corridor, taking turns and doubling back when necessary. Beatrice knew the estate well, and her steady, calm presence kept them focused. But Clara could feel the weight of their pursuit growing. She could hear the voices now, louder, closer. The guards were coming. "We're almost there," Beatrice whispered, urgency creeping into her voice. Clara nodded, but every instinct screamed that it was too late. The sounds of footsteps were unmistakable. There was no way they were going to get out of this without being caught. Pedro stopped suddenly, motioning for them to stay silent. He looked around the corner, his eyes scanning the hallway. There was no one in sight, but they were running out of time. The guards were on their way. "We need to split up," Pedro said quietly. "Beatrice, you take the back exit. Clara and I will head for the front. We'll cause a distraction and get out of here." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure? We'll be separated." Pedro's gaze hardened. "We don't have a choice. It's the only way we're all going to make it out." Clara nodded, her stomach in knots. This was it. Their plan to escape was in motion. The next few minutes would determine everything. "All right," Beatrice said, her voice filled with resolve. "You two head for the front. I'll take the back. Let's do this." They quickly split up, Clara and Pedro darting toward the front exit while Beatrice made her way toward the back. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts frantic as she kept pace with Pedro. Every step felt heavier than the last. The stakes had never been higher. They had the ledger, but now they had to make it out alive. As they neared the front exit, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the front gates just ahead, and the sight of them filled her with a fleeting sense of hope. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow. The guards. They had made it to the front door before they did. Run! Pedro shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Clara didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. Pedro was right behind her, his breath heavy but steady. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the quiet halls, but it wasn't the guards they were worried about now, it was the rush of adrenaline pushing them forward. They reached the front gates but they were locked. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Pedro, we can't stop now, she said, panic in her voice. Pedro moved quickly, pulling a tool from his pocket and working on the gate. His hands were steady, but Clara could see the desperation in his eyes. They were almost free. Just as he finished unlocking the gate, Clara heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. Eduardo's men were getting closer. Move, move, move. Pedro shouted, pulling the gate open just as the guards rounded the corner. They rushed through the gate and into the dense forest beyond. The estate was behind them, but their escape was far from certain. Clara could feel the heat of the chase behind them, but she kept running, driven by the knowledge that they had the evidence they needed. They had taken the first step toward exposing Eduardo Montenegro. Now they just had to survive long enough to see it through. The dense forest had swallowed them whole, the trees towering high as they ran, their breath ragged in the cold night air. Clara, her heart still pounding in her chest, looked over her shoulder to make sure no one was following. She could hear the sound of footsteps from behind, but they were growing fainter, more distant. The guards were not as close as they had feared, but they were still out there, and Clara knew they couldn't rest until they were far enough away. Pedro, keeping pace beside her, glanced at her with an expression of determination. We've made it this far, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. We'll get through this. We just have to keep moving. Clara nodded, though the weight of the situation hadn't lightened. They had the ledger, the key to ending Eduardo's reign of power. But the threat of Eduardo's wrath still loomed large. The world they had known, the quiet life on the ranch, was gone. They had crossed a line now. There was no going back. They kept moving deeper into the forest, knowing that Eduardo would stop at nothing to get the ledger back. But they had a plan, one that would expose Eduardo's darkest secrets and bring him to his knees. Days later, after careful planning and using their few remaining allies, Clara, Pedro, and Beatrice found themselves in a small, safe house, far from the reach of Eduardo's men. The ledger, now secured, was in their possession. It was time to make the truth known. Beatrice had arranged a meeting with a trusted lawyer who had connections to the government. They needed someone who could help them expose the corruption that had run unchecked for years, and this lawyer was the key. If they could get the evidence into the right hands, Eduardo's empire would crumble. Beatrice placed the ledger on the table, her fingers tracing the edges as she spoke. This is the moment we've all been waiting for. We have what we need to bring him down. Clara felt a wave of hope, mingled with the fear of what was to come. The stakes were higher than ever. If they succeeded, it would mean freedom for them, and for all those Eduardo had crushed underfoot. But if they failed, they would be hunted down without mercy. The plan was set in motion. The lawyer, after carefully reviewing the ledger, contacted authorities, exposing the illegal dealings, the bribes, the human trafficking rings, and the list of crimes Eduardo had been involved in for years. The power and influence Eduardo had held were no match for the truth. As the evidence began to surface, Eduardo's world started to unravel. Authorities swooped in, his assets frozen, and his influence shattered. His allies turned against him, no longer willing to protect a man whose secrets had been laid bare for all to see. But Eduardo did not go down quietly. He fought back, making a last-ditch effort to retain his power. But it was too late. The truth had spread and the public outcry was deafening. The walls Eduardo had built to protect himself crumbled one by one. Clara and Pedro watched from a distance as the news unfolded. Their names were not known to the public, but the weight of their decision, of what they had sacrificed to protect the babies and expose Eduardo, was more than enough. Eduardo was arrested, his power stripped away as the law took its course. The Montenegro Empire fell, and with it, the grip of fear that had held the region in its thrall for so long. In the aftermath of Eduardo's downfall, life slowly began to return to normal for Clara, Pedro, and the twins. The road had been long, filled with danger and uncertainty, but they had made it through. They had brought down a tyrant and ensured that the future for the twins, Miguel and Gabriel, was no longer clouded by the shadow of their father. Clara and Pedro returned to the small ranch, their home now safe from the reach of the Montenegro family. The twins grew, surrounded by love and care, in the peaceful environment Clara had always wanted for them. Beatrice, though still carrying the weight of her past, found a new life away from the Montenegro name. She had helped bring about justice, but her journey was just beginning. The trust she had earned from Clara and Pedro had healed some of the wounds she had carried for years. As the years passed, the story of the twins became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, people could rise up, fight back, and change the course of history. The twins would grow up to know the truth of their heritage, of the love and sacrifices made for them, and of the empire that had been brought down by the courage of those who dared to stand up against tyranny. Clara stood outside one evening watching as the sun set over the ranch. The world felt still, and for the first time in a long while there was peace. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger. And now, as the twins played nearby, Clara knew they had a future filled with hope, a future they had fought for and one they would never let anyone take away.